Our set of notes for tonight takes us through the last years of the Civil War. Up to this point, we've covered the build-up to the war, the early part of the war, where the North was struggling to achieve the goals of the Anaconda Plan, especially in Virginia, where Robert E. Lee was winning a lot of battles. We've covered how the war changed in 1863. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and the South won the important turning point battles at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. So now we're going to talk about the last couple of years, 1864 to 1865, where the war finally comes to a close. And it's going to come to a close at the house shown here, the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So in March of 1864, General Grant was appointed to lead the Northern armies. Remember, he'd been out west, leading the armies out west. He had helped capture Vicksburg. And so President Lincoln brought him back to the east to try to close out the war and finally capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, which was, of course, letter A, attack and capture Richmond. So there was heavy, heavy fighting in 1864 in Virginia, especially in the spring and summer, around Fredericksburg and down around Richmond. You can see on the map there, Fredericksburg, a little bit north of Richmond. Grant pushed his way through and actually ended up losing more battles than he won, but kept pushing and kept pushing and kept pushing and forcing Lee backwards. That is what made General Grant very different than a lot of the other Northern generals that President Lincoln had used. Grant took a lot of losses, lost a lot of men, but he kept attacking. He didn't retreat. He didn't hesitate. He just kept attacking because he knew he had more resources and he could force the South into giving up Richmond. In June of 1864, General Grant laid siege to the city of Petersburg. Petersburg is a little bit south of Richmond, and the goal there was actually to cut off Richmond, cut off food supplies, cut off anything going into Richmond. Also in 1864, the North began the total war policy. We've talked about total war in class as the strategy of doing whatever it took to get the Southerners to give up. And that meant breaking what were considered sort of the rules of warfare. One of the common rules of warfare is civilians are off target. You know, they're off limits. They're not targets. And in total war, the goal is you got to do whatever it takes. So that meant making civilians targets, not in the sense of actually attacking civilians, but rather making them feel the hurt of war. And so they did this in a couple places. We've discussed General Sherman's March to the Sea. That was an important part of the total war strategy, where Sherman's troops went through Georgia and then up through the Carolinas and just absolutely destroyed everything in their path. Homes, crops, livestock, railroad lines, just ripped up everything. In Virginia, a general by the name of Sheridan was doing something similar, not quite to the same level of destruction, but he attacked farms in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia to destroy food supplies in Virginia. So here's a map that gives you a sense of following the sort of the yellow line there, Sherman's March to the Sea, starting in Atlanta, working southeast to Savannah, and then tearing up through South Carolina and into North Carolina. You can imagine that yellow line just being basically a path of destruction. That was the total war strategy, really make the South feel that hurt. By April of 1865, the Confederacy was falling apart. The war was almost over. The Confederate government had abandoned Richmond because General Grant had cut it off. The Confederacy had run out of resources, so the government had to move. They couldn't defend Richmond. They couldn't afford the troops to defend Richmond and still have an army out in the field. So they had to abandon Richmond. Lee's army, which is still out in the field, was running out of food and other supplies. So they're in bad shape. So Lee's idea was to get on the move, find some extra food, and then meet up with another army in North Carolina. Try to combine armies to keep fighting. And when he wasn't able to get the supplies that he needed, he decided he could not continue to fight. He could not put his men through more battles in the shape that they were in, and he decides to surrender. So in April of 1865, General Lee and General Grant met in Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. They meet in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, the same gentleman whose farm was the site of the first battle of the war up in Manassas. He said famously that the war started in his front yard and ended in his parlor. And shortly after Lee's surrender, other Confederate armies pretty quickly gave up, and the war was finally over.